What's up, everybody? So today we're back again with another video on After Virtue. I know it's tough. I've been meaning to get around to this. I just had my wisdom teeth out. It's been really tough speaking, so I meant to get this video out a couple days ago, but I just couldn't. So bear with me. We're still working through chapter 2 here. Now what I want to do is take a look at page 11 and then get into pages 12, 13, and 14. And then hopefully close the chapter off with 2 videos after this. So another 3 videos on this chapter. Again, notes are going to be linked in the video description below. So let's get right into this. We left off last time here on page 11. And MacIntyre was talking about the history of ethics here. So what I want to talk about, just briefly recapping, is that there seems to be this possible relationship, MacIntyre says, between the history of moral discourse and the history of the academic curriculum. Now, I think what he means by that is that we treat ethics as this continuing debate and divorce the thinkers from their historical and cultural context. So if you look here on page 11, about halfway down, what I'm interpreting this as there being this hyper-specialization in academic discourse. And this is leading to a denial, not really a denial, but a pushing aside of the history of philosophy. And we're going to be treating single thinkers, or teaching single thinkers, not as traditions, but as just snippets. We're teaching flashcard philosophy a lot of the times. So for instance, I have this textbook here, and it's an intro ethics textbook that I'll be using as a TA. And if you flip to the ethics section, all it is basically flashcard ethics. You're going to be getting a couple readings from, a reading from Mill, a reading from Kant, a reading from Aristotle that are 3-4 pages. And you can't really do anything but have these little bullet points. And you're getting rid of that tradition. With that, you lose out on the cultural context, the linguistic context, all of these sorts of context, the metaphysical context of all these thinkers. That's what MacIntyre is pointing out here. And this is bad, but this is going to come up later in the text, so we'll leave it at that. Now, he goes on at the bottom of page 11 to talk about this threat of nihilism. So what exactly is going on there? Now, it's this paragraph near the bottom, and what he's basically saying, and I'll read this, is he says, here's an objection. You keep speaking of possibilities of suspicions of hypotheses. And then he goes on, he says, contemporary moral argument is rationally interminable because all moral argument is always and must be rationally interminable. Contemporary moral disagreements of a certain kind cannot be resolved because no moral disagreements of that kind in any age, past, present, or future, can be resolved. This is this threat of nihilism here. And if you look at my notes here, I am going to basically sum this up as saying, look, what if there is no problem in contemporary, there's no MacIntyrean problem here in contemporary moral discourse? What if contemporary moral argument is rationally interminable because all moral argument is? That's the basic idea as he says in the text. And it just, no moral arguments can ever be rationally resolved. What if that's the case? MacIntyre's going to go on and say, well, look, maybe we got to investigate it and see. But he thinks that emotivism, which is now what we're going to get into, is really what's behind this. That is an emotivist statement, and that the culture we live in is an emotivist culture. So what the heck does that mean? Well, emotivism, and this is how he's going to challenge that threat of nihilism, by the way, is he's going to attack it through attacking emotivism. So emotivism is the doctrine that all evaluative judgments, and more specifically all moral judgments, are nothing but expressions of preference, expressions of attitude or feeling insofar as they are moral or evaluative in character. And that's going to be on the top of page 12 here. And he's going to give a quick example here where arson, being destructive of property, is wrong. That's the claim. So we have a moral and factual domain to this claim. And he says the moral element in such a judgment is always to be sharply distinguished from the factual. Factual judgments are true or false, and in the realm of fact, there are rational criteria by means of which we may secure agreement as to what is true and what is false. But moral judgments, being expressions of feeling or attitude, are neither true or false. An agreement in moral judgment is not to be secured by any rational method, for there are none. It is to be secured by producing certain non-rational effects on the emotions or attitudes of those who disagree with one. We use moral judgments not only to express our own feelings and attitudes, but also precisely produce such effects. And then he goes on to say, and I'm reading this because it's really important to understand, and I think MacIntyre expresses it very clearly. Emotivism is a theory which professes to give an account of all value judgments whatsoever. If it is true, all moral disagreement is rationally interminable. And clearly, if that is true, then certain features of contemporary moral debate do indeed have nothing to do with what is his hypothesis here. But is it true? And that's the question. That's the question that's going on here. So again, we can think about this, and I want you to think about emotivism, and I want you to think about what's going on. What it means that when I say murder is wrong, or when I say abortion is right, or abortion is wrong, or LGBT unions or behavior is morally correct or morally wrong, whatever ethical topic you want to pick, gun control, pick whatever. All I'm doing when I'm expressing those things, those moral judgments, all I'm doing is saying, yay, good for X, or boo, good, boo, bad for Y. I'm just making a claim about my emotions. I'm not actually making a truth claim. These claims can't be evaluated. They're simply expressions of my emotional content here. So that's what's going on in emotivism. And as he says, agreement and disagreement is brought about in the moral realm here, is brought about by producing non-rational effects. So you would make somebody agree or disagree with you about abortion or one of these particular topics by making them feel guilty, happy, pleasureful, etc. So moral discourse becomes not a domain of rational argumentation, if emotivism is true. It becomes a domain of rhetoric, and it becomes a domain of persuasion. And we're going to see this in probably the next video, where we bring in some concrete examples from history. So that's what emotivism is. Now let's turn to the bottom of page 12 here and take a look at C.L. Stevenson. So basically he's going to say that he was an emotivist, and he's going to say this is good means roughly the same as I approve of this, do so as well, meaning an expression of your emotions. And this is going to be found in the citation there. You can take a look at that if you want to go read that. And other emotivists have suggested to say that this is good was to utter a sentence meaning roughly hurrah for this, as I said before. And so that's what emotivism is. Again, just referencing some more thinkers here. So how are we going to approach this? What are we going to do? Well, we have a lot of critiques available, thankfully. I think that emotivism fails. It fails very hard. But I'm going to go over two of these critiques, and because they're very, very dense, but I'll mention one that I'm not going to go over first, and that's going to be the Frege-Geach problem. MacIntyre doesn't specifically bring this up in the text, but the Frege-Geach problem is a problem for all non-cognitivist ethics, and emotivism is going to be a subset of non-cognitivist ethics. The Frege-Geach problem is basically a problem with the meaning of moral language. So if you want, I can make a separate video on that, but the basic idea is that if emotivism is true, it destroys forms of reasoning such as modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, and etc., because it turns them from being valid syllogisms into committing the equivocation fallacy. Again, different topic, lots of papers been written on that. Frege-Geach problem, it's a horrible, horrible problem for non-cognitive ethics and emotivism, and I think that it is conclusive. It is a conclusive determinant of emotivism's failure as a theory of meaning. But let's turn to MacIntyre's criticisms and really look at that. So the first criticism is quite interesting. He's going to say that emotivism is actually circular. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, when somebody is an emotivist like Stevenson, they're going to say, listen, moral judgments, moral agreements, moral statements, all of these things express emotional or express some sort of approval. So they express some sort of, yay, good for abortion, yay, good for environmentalism, boo gun control, or something like that, boo murder, boo euthanasia, etc. But MacIntyre is going to say, well, what kind of approval is going on here? How are we actually approving this? What does this mean? Let's spell this out. And Emotivism is going to struggle to do this. Because Emotivism, if it says, oh, well, when we say these things, when we say boo murder, which is what a moral judgment is for emotivists, when we say that, well, is that moral approval? And if so, we're presupposing a moral system. So if I say abortion is wrong, which for the emotivist translates into boo abortion, is that moral approval? Am I approving of that moral stance? Because that if I approve of that moral position, I'm presupposing a morality. Okay, so emotivism is presupposed morality. Well, if we take the other route and say, well, it expresses emotional approval or disapproval, well, in that case, what exactly does that mean? If I say that euthanasia is good, and and the emotivist translates that as saying, hurrah for euthanasia, well, if that expresses emotional approval, what exactly is emotional approval at all? Is it some sort of feeling of pleasure or goodness that I have? And why, crucially here, why do I have those feelings and those approvals? And when we think about that, we realize that those feelings or approvals are the result of some sort of ethical stance, some sort of moral position underlying emotivism. So again, to recap that short point, because it was complex, if I say, yay, hurrah for euthanasia, as the emotivist would say, a moral judgment that's pro-euthanasia is, well, if that's cashed out in terms of emotional approval, then I have to ask, what exactly is emotional approval? And emotional approval, then that leads to me asking, okay, well, where does that emotional approval come from? Well, it comes from me already presupposing that emotional approval or that euthanasia is in some way good and should lead me to having these positive emotions. So emotional approval and moral approval are presupposing some sort of morality, and emotivism has become circular. I'm going to skip over this second criticism because I think it would make the video quite long, because I think it's just, it would require a whole video on its own, but you can go and investigate that. I really want to get into this third criticism though, because I think that's the most important, and it's going to really dominate the rest of the text. So MacIntyre is going to point out here, and I want you to follow along in my notes because I have it mapped out here. Emotivism is a theory. It's purported to be a theory about the meaning of sentences. But as the Frege-Geach problem shows, and as our criticisms have shown, it is clearly about their use on certain occasions. Emotivism is clearly a theory not about the meaning, but about the use of moral judgments. So we can bring in Gilbert Ryle's example here. The angry schoolmaster shouting 7 times 7 is 49. His shouting expresses feelings, but it has nothing to do with the meaning of the sentence. It has to do with the use of the sentence. So I have my own example here, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but sayings like, you cheated on me, you're fake, these fake insults, okay? So I've had people insult me and say things like, oh, you're such a fake person, or, oh, you're such an XYZ. And I'm like, okay, well, how? And then they're like, oh, well, I don't know. It's just like, I don't know. That's just my feelings. And so that claim is not expressing a literal truth. It's expressing someone's feelings. So it's expressing their use of language. It's not expressing a meaning. And that's really interesting to ponder on. And I'm sure when you get into a fight with somebody, I want you to kind of think about that and think about whether they're using these statements to convey literal truths or whether they're using these statements to convey their emotional use of language. And in instances of cheating, like in a spouse or something, that's not going to be so much, that's going to be a more literal truth, but it can also convey an emotional use. So if the person says it in a very angry manner, like this Gilbert Ryle example, then that's going to convey a dual meaning, a literal meaning, and an emotional use, and it's going to express the emotional content. So let's now turn and kind of detail this out a little bit more. People use these evaluative judgments to express arbitrary choices and emotions and to manipulate others into their own positions. They do not actually mean what they say. Okay, so this is a crucial point here. So people are using a lot of the time moral evaluative judgments to express their arbitrary choices of principles, which we discussed in the previous couple of videos, and to discuss their emotions, to convey their emotions, as the Riley schoolmaster and the fake insults examples showed. They do not literally mean what they say. And so a lot of times in moral disagreements, this is also the case. So if I say euthanasia is good, then sometimes I am conveying sometimes I'm conveying, or all the time, I should say, I'm conveying my arbitrary personal preferences for the principles which I have already chosen to inform that argument. We discussed this in the previous video here. So I think that this is the most important criticism of emotivism here, and that's that emotivism is a theory about the use of moral judgments. It's not a theory about the meaning of them. It's a theory about the use. It's a theory about how they're used. And if we can start to look at moral judgments in this way, then we can start to use emotivism as a tool to uncover the masks of modernity and contemporary ethics. And that's what MacIntyre is going to do here. He's going to be saying, look, emotivism was purported to be a theory about the meaning of moral judgments. It was purported to be a theory about the meaning of our ethical discourse. But in reality, when we look at it, it's a theory about how the judgments are used. So let's take a look at the text to wrap up here. He's going to say, if the emotive theory thus interpreted were correct, it would follow that the meaning and the use of moral expressions were, or at the very least, had become radically discrepant with each other. Meaning and use would be at odds in such a way that meaning would tend to conceal use. We could not safely infer what someone who uttered a moral judgment was doing merely by listening to what he said. Moreover, the agent himself might well be among those for whom use was concealing meaning. So what he's saying here is, if emotivism is a theory about the meaning of moral judgments, it would collapse meaning and use, okay? And this is going to be how he gets to that point where he says, look, emotivism is a theory about the use of moral judgments rather than meaning. He's performing a reductio ad absurdum, it seems, to where he's saying, look, if emotivism was a theory about the meaning of moral judgments, then we would come to this absurd result where meaning and use would be completely conflated. So that can't be it. Ergo, emotivism is really a theory about how we use ethical terms, ethical judgments, etc. So you can go ahead and read this and kind of dwell on it, because I think it's quite difficult to grasp. But the main point is that emotivism is now being recapitulated as a tool that we are going to use in our investigation of modernity. We have argued that emotivism as a theory about the meaning of moral judgments, i.e., a theory that says that moral judgments mean emotional states and contact, or emotional states such as hurrah for murder or boo abortion, that fails, again, because of the vicious circularity, the Frege-Geach problem, and MacIntyre's criticisms here, his reductio here on page 14. So because it fails, emotivism fails as a theory about the meaning of moral judgments, we're going to regroup, and we're going to take emotivism and apply it and say, look, it's actually a theory about the use of moral judgments. It's conveying great truth about how we use moral judgments. And that truth is that we use moral judgments to express our arbitrary emotional content about the principles that inform those moral judgments and arguments. That's the key takeaway here. That's what we're going to do from now on. And so we're going to take that insight, emotivism as expressing a truth about how we use moral judgments, and we are going to apply that to modernity in our demolition project of modernity. So I'm going to leave you with that today, and I want you to think about that, and I will recap a little bit in the next video. Again, please like, comment, subscribe. I'm loving this project so far. I think it's a great text. We're going to keep plugging away at it. It's going to take us a while, but we're going to get so much out of it. Thanks. Have fun.